So, 2,208 passengers and crew members from 42 countries and regions went on the first and only voyage on the Titanic. 1,496 people died. 712 were saved on the night of April 14th to 15th. 1912, the liner was in the North Atlantic. The crew received 7 ice warnings during the day. The data was charted and the route was corrected. However, some of the radiograms were ignored. The radio operator at that moment was busy with other things, and this played its fatal role. Besides, the night was clear. The water surface was calm. The moon was not shining. All this together created ideal conditions for the observers not to notice the iceberg in time. Titanic was going at high speed, which, however, was not prohibited by maritime rules, and therefore the collision could not be avoided. The iceberg as if scratched the ship's plating. As a result, 5 compartments were flooded. We remember, buoyancy was preserved when 4 were flooded, and in 2 hours and 40 minutes the ship sank. This is the end of the general public's understanding of what happened to the Titanic and what happened next. All survivors were picked up by the British passenger steamer Carpathia, although the Californian was the closest to the site of the tragedy. On the evening of April 18th, the survivors arrived in New York. Michigan Senator William Smith, who worked as legal counsel for transportation companies, proposed a special investigation. He appealed to the leadership of the Senate, as well as to U.S. President William Howard Taft, but found no understanding. When it became clear that on the Titanic died on the military assistant to the President Archibald, but Taft changed his mind and ordered the creation of a Senate committee, which was headed by Smith. The hearings began on April 19th, the day after the Carpathia arrived in New York. The commission held a total of 18 meetings and interviewed more than 80 witnesses, the most valuable too. The commission was the testimony of the second assistant captain of the Titanic, Charles Herbert Lightoller, a total of 4 out of 8 officers and 42 out of 66 people of the deck crew survived after the wreck. The commission noted that he gave evasive answers to many questions, taking advantage of the fact that the senators were not well acquainted with the subject of conversation in principle. However, the commission treated the assistant captain gently. Given the scale of the tragedy he had experienced, Lightoller, in particular, was asked for precise information on lifeboats. There were not enough of them, but passenger ships in those days were equipped with lifeboats, not according to the number of passengers, but according to an average standard. The Titanic was supposed to have 20 lifeboats, and that's exactly how many there were. Lightoller claimed that before going on a voyage, tests were carried out, the lifeboats were launched, checking the serviceability of the mechanisms. Why did the Titanic die? Today we know all the details of that night, when the unsinkable ship collided with an iceberg. But for contemporaries, the reasons for the disaster were not obvious. Our ideas about the tragedy that occurred with the Titanic and its causes are largely formed by cinematography, and in particular, the popular movie. The picture reproduces many details of the fateful voyage, but, of course, cannot be considered a reliable source of information, if only because it focuses on the fate of the characters, not the details of the disaster. Yes, indeed, there was panic on the ship. There were not enough seats in the lifeboats, and could not be enough. And the ship's orchestra continued to play until the Titanic sank. But the movie itself has also already become part of the rich mythology that has developed around this ship. The numerous speculations can be dispelled largely thanks to the investigations to which this article is dedicated. They had to restore the picture of what happened on the Titanic and find out why the tragedy acquired such proportions. Immediately after the arrival of the surviving passengers in the United States, a special Senate commission began to work. A little later, Britain began its own investigation based on a true story. At the time of its construction, the Titanic was the largest ship in the world. It was owned by the British company White Star Line, the owner of which, however, was an American banker and railroad magnate John Pierpont Morgan. White Star Line owned 2 other ships of the same series, Olympic and Britannic. Titanic was built second after the Olympic, and its displacement was increased, compared to its predecessor by 243 tons. Many people have the idea that the Titanic was almost the first unsinkable ship, and the company owner claimed that it was not in danger of disaster. However, this is one of the most common myths about the liner. It really had a double bottom. The lower decks as well as the hold were divided into 16 compartments by watertight bulkheads. Titanic, in theory, stayed afloat. If any two compartments or four adjacent fore or aft compartments were flooded, this is what is called unsinkability. White Star Line never claimed that the Titanic was unsinkable in principle. The advertising brochures made a disclaimer that unsinkability was ensured at the highest possible level. However, it was this characteristic that both journalists and the public clung to when the liner sank on its maiden voyage. The Titanic was certainly not only the largest, but also one of the most luxurious passenger ships for its time. The most expensive first-class cabin cost £500, while the captain of the Titanic received £1,250 a year. However, aristocrats by no means made up the bulk of the passengers. About 700 people were placed in the third class. They were laborers, farmers, agricultural workers who went to America in search of a better life. When buying tickets, however, the assistant captain hid part of the truth. None of the crew knew whether a fully loaded boat could be launched. That is why there were vacant seats in some dinghies. The crew did not want to take risks, fearing overloading. According to some estimates, an additional 400 people could have been saved. The commission was also interested in whether everything possible was done to save the passengers, whether the third-class passengers had the same opportunities to get into the lifeboats as the others. There were other witnesses. Second radio operator Harold Bride said he knew nothing about the radiograms his colleague Phillips might have received. It appeared that the coordination of personnel on the ship had been disrupted. One of the officers, Joseph Boxhall, allegedly spotted a ship just a few miles away from the Titanic that did not assist the liner. Sailor Frederick Fleet, who saw the ill-fated iceberg, said that there were no binoculars at the observation point, although the sailors asked for them. The binoculars on the Titanic, by tragic coincidence, were indeed locked in a safe. Great importance was attached to the testimony of Joseph Bruce Ismay, managing director of White Star Line, who also went on the first voyage of the Titanic. At that time, the so-called Harder Act was in force in the USA, according to which, in case of shipwreck, passengers and their relatives could claim compensation for damages if it turned out that the management of the shipping company knew about the violation of navigation rules. The Titanic was formerly owned by an American corporation. If the investigation found out that Ismay knew about the violations committed by the command, lawsuits from victims would swamp the company. In addition, the senators had suspicions that the very presence of the director of White Star Line could influence the actions of the captain. In particular, that is why the Titanic was going at top speed. On May 28th, the commission published its conclusion. The alarm on the Titanic was not properly announced. The passengers did not have full knowledge of what was happening. There was no general alarm. The third-class passengers were not alerted to the danger in a timely manner, but this is partly because many of them had poor command of English. A preliminary inspection of the life-saving equipment was not properly conducted. The ship's captain, Edward John Smith, showed indifference to the danger, which was one of the causes of the wreck. Ismay did not give the order to leave the Titanic at maximum speed, but his presence could have negatively affected the captains as a result. The American Commission concluded that the sinking of the Titanic was caused by force majeure, or, in Anglo-American law, God's providence. U.S. officials, and it was a blow to the British ego. In their view, the foreign power had, as they called it, meddled in the wrong business. The ship's crew, Royal Navy officers, were forced to testify to U.S. officials, and it was a blow to the British ego. In their view, a foreign power had, as they called it, meddled in the wrong business. The newspapers, too, allowed themselves a little too much. When the Titanic had already been damaged and began to send SOS signals, one of the first to respond was the German ship Frankfurt. However, the prevailing fuss made its own adjustments, and the air began a real confusion. The inquiries Frankfurt did not really answer. German newspapers wrote that if there had been a German crew on the Titanic, the tragedy would not have happened. This was another stone to the English sailors, a remark that made them very vulnerable. The British set up their own commission, which consisted primarily of people familiar with maritime affairs and shipowners. The commission focused on the behavior of the crew, namely, why many sailors escaped while passengers perished. Lord Mercy, who chaired the commission, eventually admitted, "The witnesses have convinced me that the officers were very conscientious in the performance of their duties, without thought of themselves. The discipline of the passengers and crew during the launching of the lifeboats was also of the highest order, but the organization could have been better, and if it had been, more lives might have been saved." It should be noted that many crew members had to get into the dinghies. Apart from them, no one knew the rules of conduct on the water and would not have been able to organize the rowers. Most importantly, the work of both commissions resulted in the formulation of proposals that could prevent such disasters in the future, to reduce speed in the area of drifting ice, to bring to the attention of the entire crew important messages about the navigational situation, to equip the vessels with lifeboats designed to rescue all passengers and crew, to conduct drills, etc. And this, perhaps, was the main result of the conducted investigations.